The purpose of this video is to discuss a method for designing and developing code, and it's intended for new coders who maybe have a little bit of experience, but not a lot. And basically, they're for my students who have a lot of experience working with Scratch, but are just beginning to work with text-based language. And we're using Codesters, which is a very nice little environment that teaches you how to use Python. So I thought I would discuss a little bit, how do you go about designing and developing a project, and especially one that, as you get more experience, they're going to get a little more complex, and just what are ways to kind of maybe break down all the bits and pieces of it. What I've got on screen here is I'm creating a project that will average some grades. Purposely making this a simple kind of question because we want to concentrate on process more than anything. So it's just called the grade averager. And then I pseudocode here. It's a little hard to see, but I called it pseudocode. And pseudocode, the pseudo part means false code, and it's a designing technique where you basically just describe the different things you want to do in your program, and perhaps put in some of the structures that you want, just things to help you lay out what you want your code to do without actually having to get bogged down in detail. I'll show you an example I did here, and Codesters has the place for you to put your name and a place for description. I am actually going to put the description mostly in the code itself, and I may not be 100% following everything in the Python style guide. I'm pretty new to Python, like many of you watching this video are, so I'm learning also. So I apologize to any people very knowledgeable in Python who might be looking and are cringing a little bit. Here's what I'm doing. So these little hashtag or pound sign, number sign symbols mean that there's a comment. So I just kind of put the name of it up near the top. But when you have a big, long comment, especially something that's describing what's going on in your code, I'm using what is called a docstring. And a docstring is basically just a character string that we're not really doing anything with. It's just for information. So I'm giving further information between them. So there's 3 double quotes, and then you end your big docstring comment with another 3 double quotes. So I'm putting most of my information here, and this is me starting to think about what I want my project to be. And if you think that you want to have every single thing done at once, that really does make things a lot harder. It's nice to kind of chunk up what you want to do and do it in little phases or installments. I've thought about just basically what I want this to look like a little bit, not 100% everything, and I've decided on different versions of the code. So different stages along the way. When I first do my version 1, it's just my initial thoughts. Version 2 expands on that, version 3 expands on that, and so on. So let's see what I've come up with. So this project will average some grades, and I want my grades to be integers, and that's a requirement I'm putting there. It doesn't have to be, but that's what I'm deciding to do, and then display their average. And so this particular file is holding version 1, and my version 1 is going to be the pseudocode phase. And I have some other ones that I thought about that maybe this could be how I develop the different pieces. So version 1 is this one, the pseudocode. The next one, version 2, I'm going to have a proof of concept. So I'm mostly going to use the console, and we'll get to that a little bit later, exactly what that means. But just to make sure, can I actually do it? After I know I can do kind of the meat of my project, I'll go to version 3, which is to pretty it up a little bit. And I'm going to use some of the Codesters sprites. They have some really nice classes and objects that we can use. How do I get my data in? Start of the validating of that data. And then maybe I'm just going to average 5 numbers at this point and display that average. And maybe a later version, I can average n numbers. That is, there is no hard limit on it. And then maybe a good data validation, anything that I've missed in the previous version. And I haven't really thought very far past that, so I just put a little question mark there, because I'm thinking as I work through these versions, there may be more things that I naturally think about and want to add to these versions, which is perfectly fine. I want to do this a step at a time. So the pseudocode, this is where comments can really be helpful. Here is a technique for commenting code as well as thinking about your code. So I'm using Python comments. Those are lines that start with that hashtag symbol, number symbol, pound sign, whatever you want to call that. Nothing will happen when you run this code because it's all comments basically. There's nothing here. But these are basically notes to myself. If I'm averaging grades, I guess the first thing I have to do is get grades to average somehow. And initially, I'm thinking I only want to have a certain number of them, a hard stop on how many I can do. And I want my grades to be integers, but thinking about it, when you average integers, you add up n numbers and then divide by that n, you don't necessarily get an integer back. It could be a floating point number, meaning there could be some decimals afterwards, so I have to consider that. Now, depending on how I get these grades, I may have to validate them. So my initial thoughts are I'm going to ask the user to input these grades. I have to validate that they're putting in integers, and to me, grades shouldn't be negative numbers, so maybe check for that. There may be other things I have to validate about what they're typing in. I'm putting a little kind of placeholder that I need to do that. And then once I've got validated numbers, I want to find their average, and just using normal means, adding up the number of numbers and dividing by however many I have, and then somehow display this number. And I think just to give a little bit of interest, a little bit of logic, maybe if the average is below a passing grade, you give one message, and if it's above, maybe you give another, and I'm going to define a failing grade as being some average less than 65. That's my pseudocode, my very, very high level pseudocode. Does that mean I could never do anything else here? Of course not. And so once I have my version done, I don't really want to change my version 1. I sort of want to save it so that if I ever I'm working 3 versions down and I'm confused about what I wanted to do to begin with, I can always come back to this file. And in the real world, if you were coding this, there are different data repositories or places where you can put this stuff. For instance, there's one called GitHub, there's another one called Bitbucket, and these are places where you can save different versions of your code. I don't believe that Codesters has a way for us to do that, and I've been searching and I couldn't even find a way to make a nice clean copy of this within Codesters. What I am going to do is I'm going to save this, and the way you save in Codesters, especially when you're creating your own project like I am, is you press the little blue little skeuomorph there of a save of a disk, and now I know that's saved for good. I'm going to make a copy of this so I can work on version 2, and my version 2 will be the proof of concept. So I don't know if this is the best way. There may be another way to do this. I just don't know what it is. So I'm actually just going to do a copy and paste into a new project. I go back to my projects. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to paste in what I copied before. And this is my grade averager, but this time I'm doing my proof of concept. So this averages grades, and it's version 2. I think I put that in all caps in the other one. So I'll do the same thing here. And then I want to change what this says. So now I'm working on version 2, and this is my proof of concept. And I have noticed that many coders, new coders and old coders, really don't like spending time on comments and documenting and that sort of thing. But I do think it's really important, especially if someday you want to make a really big project or you want to collaborate with other people to make projects. The Python style guide does say that code is read more than it's written, and I think that's very true. Taking a little time in the beginning to document what you're doing, I think, is really important. This is version 2. If I ever need version 1, it's in another file and I can get it, but now I'm going to move to the next thing. So these pseudocode comments are going to become kind of high-level comments. And commenting code should not be an afterthought. You really should comment as you go along. And if you've written pseudocode, you sort of have it already. So I think what we need to do first is get some numbers. And because this is just a proof of concept, I'm not even going to do anything very fancy here. I'm only going to use the console. If you don't know what the console is, see this little P over here? If you kind of hover over it, it says console. If you click that, when there's nothing going on, you really can't see a difference. You might see it almost looks like a curtain going up and down. It's where I can print things or input things. It's, well, I'll demonstrate what it is. Let's say I want to input a grade. So I'm going to say grade 1 equals. Now I'm using a console command, and if you don't know what they are, I'm clicking on the side here under logic. See where they have console? And so they have examples of various things here. And so I want to input something, right? I want to get some information here. So I'm going to input, that's the statement, And then I'm going to ask for enter grade 1. And when I run, first I'm going to save because I save a lot. But if I run this, as long as I have the console page showing, right? If I don't, you won't see anything. This part here is the Codester stage. But it says, okay, do a thing. I can enter a number. At least I should be able to. And then that's all my code does. So it's pretty much ending right here. But that's what the console is. And the console is a nice place to just test things out. It's great for when you're debugging. You want to print out values, things like that. I'm going to add that first grade. And then it says validate that the grade is an integer and it's non-negative. And now that I'm thinking about it, one grade, I'm not going to give an average there, right? I'm going to need another grade also. So let's say I have a grade 2, and that's also an input. I'm probably going to do very similar processing for when I validate each grade. So whenever I start thinking about, I'm going to be repeating code over and over, maybe that means I'm going to need a function of some kind. So I'm going to create a function that I want to use here. And you need to have defined your functions before you're using them. Let's do that. So when you create a function, you use the word def and then your function name. So let's call this validate grade entry. And maybe I pass in a grade of some kind. And then the syntax, or what Python is expecting next, is a colon there. And the Codesters environment automatically will tab you over 4 spaces. The Python style guide prefers spaces, where you just hit the spacebar 4 times. But luckily, this little environment was already putting it in there. Now I'm going to create a little stub. And what's a stub? So I'm just going to remind myself with a comment that this is a stub. So a stub says, here's this thing, but I don't want to write the whole thing right now. I don't want to kind of go down this rabbit hole of figuring out how to validate a number just yet. So I'm going to create a little stub that basically just doesn't do anything yet. And then when I have time, I'm going to come back and do this thing. I'm going to put my comment in for what this thing does. So I'm going to create a little docstring area. So this will validate that the input grade is a non-negative integer, which is a whole number. And so maybe that's all I want for now, but usually what a good thing here is to put like what your inputs are. And so you're going to input a grade, which could be anything, I guess, maybe. And then your output, because you have to tell whoever's calling this what happened. I don't know yet for sure what I want to do, so I think true will mean it's valid, and perhaps false means it isn't. And then whoever calls this thing can check that. I'm not really doing anything, but if I were to call this at this point, it would kind of blow up. So I'm just going to put in a return statement to give a value back, and I'm just going to default it to true because, well, I just don't know yet what I want it to do. So for now, I'm just going to always say that the data is valid. When I'm ready to work this problem, I'll come back here, and then I'll take out that word stub because the word stub is my signal that something needs to change. So inputs come back as characters, and I want this to be a number. So I'm going to validate. So if validate grade entry for grade 1. So if that comes back as true, that means everything was fine for that. I want to save this value, so save the character. Right, there's a character string grade to an integer value. And so we can do that by saying, and I don't know if this style is especially loved, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to take the character string grade 1 that the input function returned back to me and turn it into an integer, and I'm storing it back into grade 1. So instead of being a string, now it's numbers. And then I want to validate the other one. So if validate grade entry grade 2, and I'm just going to put a comment, good grade 2. and I'm going to save that as an integer as well. And then for my own sake, this is probably something that many coders will disagree with me on, and that's okay. But I like putting my little a comment here to know where I am, because I do get confused in these things. So these comments just say, okay, that's the end of that if. If I need to put an else in, I can see where the indentation took place, and this is that one, the end of that if. If I need an else, I kind of know where to put it. Might even put a little white space there so I can sort of see what I've got. And I periodically, I just like to run just to see if I've broken anything. I'm just entering anything here. And because my stub doesn't do anything except return true, there's nothing of interest here. But I've got to start. And then I have to think about, okay, so these grades, these validate part, I'm not really doing it there. So I'm going to move my comment to where I'm actually doing it, right? And then so once I get here, I'm going to start a new part of code, which is this next thing. So I'm going to move all this stuff here up to where my good path is at the moment. So I want to find the average of the grades. And so maybe I want this to be a function as well. I don't know if I want all this in here. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But since I don't feel like thinking too hard about it yet, I might make another little stub for how to find the average. So I'm going to create another little function here called average numbers. My training is to always start functions with a verb, which I don't know if that's still a thing, but that's what I do. So I want to average numbers. Now I'm thinking about what has to go in here, but for now I'm just going to write the word pass here. And so pass is just, you can't have like a branch of something with nothing in it. So it's just a statement that does nothing, but it's going to make my code hopefully not blow up, because maybe now I want to just say average numbers here. It's just as a placeholder, and again, I'm just checking, am I breaking things, as I go along, and so far I haven't. And then we would say display. So at this point, I can't even put anything in here because my average numbers needs to return a value. So instead of a pass here, maybe I should just figure out how to do it. And I did a little research on what's a good way to do this. Now, I could actually go and add all these numbers, 1 and 2, divide by 2. But I'm thinking in the future, what happens when I have more than 2 numbers? Do I really want to pass in 3 things, 5 things, 10 things? Do I want to define a limit on how many numbers? So eventually, I want to pass in as many things as the person wants, right? Whoever is using this. And to me, that means I need a list of some kind. And we've looked at lists, at least my class has, working with Scratch. They have lists, and Python does too. Boy, does Python have lists. They have lots of lists. But I'm thinking I probably want to pass a list of numbers in, and then it becomes a lot easier to figure out its average, I think. So I'm going to pass something in here. I'm just going to call it grades. And let me just put a little doc string in to explain what's happening. So let's put a comment in. So I want to average the numbers in the input list. So my input, and let me make a little blank space there. Input is a list of integers, and the output, their average. And just to remind myself, that's a floating point number. And so if I have a list of them, there's actually a pretty easy way to do this. And I looked under statistics because we have this, certain functions are already imported into Codesters. And so mean, that's exactly what I want. That's an average. And it says my var equals mean with my data. And I believe that's a list. I think that's how it works. So I'm not going to pass anymore. I'm going to return, and it's just one statement, the mean of grades, because my grades should be a list. Now here's something else I might want to put in. I'm like, just to make sure this is working, I'm going to put a print statement. And what a print statement does is it will print a string to my console, and this is kind of debug. I just want to print the average is, and I'm leaving a blank in between. Plus means now concatenate or add this next thing on there. And I want a string, because this whole thing is a string. Oops. of the mean of those grades. I'm not going to make sure I have enough. I think I need another parenthesis there. And my hope is that when I run this, I can have a printout so I can see what I'm returning back to whoever's calling this. So that means here, so now it's returning something. So I need to set that equal to something, and I also need to pass in a list. Let's put those grades that I have here into a list. Store all the grades into a list. And so I'm going to call that thing grades, and it is going to equal, and this is the syntax for a list. You have 2 of these square brackets, and then you put in what you want to go in there. So I'm going to put grade 1 and grade 2 into this list. And then in here, I'm going to pass in grades, right? Because, oops, I don't know why I had a 2 there. That's not right. And the only way to know if it works is to actually try it. So I'm going to do a save just in case something bad happens. So 80 and a 90. If I put a 90 in, I know what the answer should be. And it worked. Average is 85. The reason that's printing that out is because I have my little print statement there. Again, if I turn off my console, nothing is happening on the Codester stage because I haven't used any of their graphic objects yet. Just kind of doing my proof of concept. Does this work? And then maybe we want to do something here. So if, let's see, if average grade is less than 65, because that's what I have here, then what do I want to do? I want to print, just for now, average is a failing grade. That's not a very nice message, but it is. And then print it. And then else, print, I don't know, hooray, average is a passing grade. And print it here. And we'll see if this works. So I want to actually test both those paths. So I want to make sure it works if I get something bigger than 65, or if I get something smaller, and what happens if it's exactly 65. So this is kind of just, again, testing my proof of concept. Am I doing the minimum requirements here? So I put in an 80 and a 90. Oops, I forgot to do something. Ah, yes. So average grade is coming back as a float, and you have to only have strings in your print statements. So I forgot to do that, which I always forget to do. So I'm fixing that now. I also don't like my use of white space here. I am very big on white space to make things a little bit clearer. Let's try again. I'm going to save also. So let's try 80, 90, yay. Okay, so that's one path, the path where you are bigger than 65. Let's try now another path. Let's just pick small numbers, 50 and 60, right? And that's a failing grade. Is it smart enough to know what to do exactly at 65? That's easy enough. I'll just make both these numbers 65. So if you're exactly at 65, that's good. But if you're at 64, then it's bad. My proof of concept kind of does what I wanted this thing to do. It's just not very elegant at this point. But I think for my version 2, I've got a lot of code in here. I'll make sure I save it. One thing I also do with Codesters is it's saving it. That's great. I tend to always just save this somewhere else. So depending on, I'm on a Mac right here, so I would probably just do a copy of all this and put it in a note somewhere. If you're on a Windows or a Chrome, just do a Control-C or a copy, everything, paste it into a file, and store it somewhere where that information gets backed up. Codesters is pretty good. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are occasions where sometimes things get lost. Big believer in a backup. And so I would keep this as my version 2, and then when I'm ready for version 3, I would not change this again. So if I had some kind of software repository, I would upload this as a version so that if I ever need to get back to it, I can. So save this off to a file, and then copy it again into version 3. And I've made some notes. What do I want to do in version 3? Well, it works. It's kind of, but it's boring and it's ugly. And if I run on the Codester stage, like nothing happens. So you want to start adding in your Codester sprites and how is the user going to input the data, and maybe you need to start thinking about the validation, because now if I run mine, I very carefully put in good numbers, but what if I put in something bad? It's going to blow up because the int function, it has to be an integer that you're converting to. So I'm going to deal with that in the next version, and so on. So I'm not going to do that all now. Maybe working on validation is actually a good thing to do another video on, because that can be a little tough. I hope this helps give you an idea of a method for developing good code in an incremental fashion, so that you just do a little bit at a time so that it doesn't seem too overwhelming. So I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you for watching.